He thought humiliating her would make him king of the hallway. But he had no idea he was stepping into a moment no one there would ever forget. Because in Lincoln High, where reputations were built on noise and dominance, Emily Carter existed like a shadow that no one bothered to see. Always in the same faded gray hoodie, always walking along the lockers with her eyes lowered. Her steps measured and quiet as if she had learned long ago that silence was safer than attention, and for most students, she was just background, someone you passed without remembering, someone who never argued, never reacted, never pushed back, which was exactly why Jason Miller noticed her, because Jason didn't look for challenges. He looked for certainty, and nothing was more certain than someone who wouldn't fight back, someone who would shrink, someone who would make him look bigger without him having to try too hard. And as he leaned against the row of lockers that morning, surrounded by friends who laughed a little too loudly at everything he said, he watched Emily approach like she always did, alone, steady, predictable. And in his mind, that predictability made her the perfect target, the kind of person who could be turned into a moment, a joke, a story he could replay in front of everyone to remind them who was in control. And when she stepped closer, adjusting the strap of her worn backpack, he exchanged a glance with his friends, the kind that didn't need words, because everyone already knew what was about to happen. The phone subtly came out, the smirk spread, the energy in the hallway shifted just enough for people nearby to slow down and watch. And Emily, as always, seemed unaware, her gaze fixed ahead, her expression calm, almost detached, like none of it touched her, like none of them mattered. And that, more than anything, irritated Jason, because it felt like she wasn't even acknowledging the game, wasn't giving him the reaction he expected, and in that small gap between expectation and reality, something sharper formed in his decision, something more deliberate, more public, more pointed, because if she wouldn't react on her own, he would make sure she had no choice. And just as she passed him, the hallway noise dipped slightly, like the building itself was holding its breath, and Jason pushed off the locker with a casual confidence, stepping directly into her path, his shadow cutting across hers, blocking her movement in a way that seemed almost effortless, almost routine, as if this moment had already been decided long before it happened. And for the first time, Emily stopped, not abruptly, not startled, just paused, lifting her eyes slowly, meeting his gaze with something that wasn't fear, wasn't defiance, just stillness, the kind that didn't belong in a place like this. And for a fraction of a second, something in the air shifted, subtle but undeniable, like a line had just been crossed that no one else could see yet. And Jason, mistaking that stillness for weakness, smiled. Already convinced he had won before anything had even begun, Jason tilted his head slightly, studying her as if waiting for the reaction he had seen 100 times before, the nervous glance away, the awkward apology, the quiet attempt to slip past and disappear. But Emily Carter did not move. She did not step back. She did not rush to fill the silence. She simply stood there with that same steady gaze. And for a brief moment that stretched longer than it should have, Jason felt something unfamiliar press against his confidence, something subtle but enough to make his smile tighten just a fraction, and behind him his friends shifted, their anticipation hanging in the air like static, one of them letting out a low chuckle as a phone camera adjusted focus, waiting for the moment to unfold. Because in their minds this was already entertainment, already decided, and Emily was supposed to play her part, but she remained still, her posture relaxed, her shoulders level, her breathing even, as if none of this carried any weight. And that lack of reaction began to feel louder than any protest ever could, forcing Jason to lean in just slightly, closing the space between them in a way that made the situation more visible to everyone watching, because if she would not react, he would create a reason for her to, his voice dropping just enough to carry across the hallway without sounding forced, asking a question that was not really a question at all, something simple meant to draw attention, to pull her into the performance he had already built in his head. And still, Emily did not answer right away, her eyes steady, focused, almost as if she was measuring something invisible, something beyond him. And that pause, that controlled silence, began to shift the energy in ways no one expected. The laughter that had started to rise now hesitated. The phone still held up, but no longer as confident, because there was something off about the way she held herself, something that did not match the role they had assigned to her. And as Jason waited, expecting compliance, expecting discomfort, Emily finally spoke, her voice calm, low, and completely unshaken, not defensive, not aggressive, just present. And it was not what she said that unsettled him. It was how she said it, because there was no trace of fear, no urgency to escape, only a quiet certainty that did not belong to someone in her position. And for a second, Jason's expression flickered, the smallest crack in the image he worked so hard to maintain. But pride pushed him forward, forcing a laugh, louder this time, sharper, as he glanced back at his friends to anchor himself, to remind himself of the role he was playing. And as the hallway noise slowly tried to return, there was still that undercurrent, that subtle shift no one could quite explain, like something inevitable had already started moving beneath the surface. And Emily, standing exactly where she was, gave no sign of backing down, no sign of escalation either. Just that same composed presence that made it impossible to predict what would happen next. And somewhere in the back of the crowd, someone lowered their phone just slightly, no longer sure if they were about to capture a joke or the beginning of something else entirely. Jason's laugh lingered in the air a second too long, louder than it needed to be, as if he was trying to convince not just everyone else, but himself that everything was still under control, that this was still his moment, his stage. But the truth was already shifting beneath his feet, subtle and quiet, the way a storm builds before anyone notices the clouds. And Emily Carter remained exactly where she stood, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, not challenging him, not yielding either, just existing in a way that made his usual playbook feel strangely ineffective. And for someone like Jason, who thrived on predictable reactions, that unpredictability began to feel like resistance, even though she had not raised her voice or moved an inch. And that was when he made the decision to push further, to force the moment into something clearer, something louder, something that would bring the attention fully back to him. Because silence was not something he knew how to control, and he stepped closer, just enough to make the space between them disappear completely, his presence now unavoidable, his shadow overlapping hers again as the crowd leaned in, waiting, expecting the tension to break in the way. It always did, but Emily did not retreat. She did not flinch, and that lack of movement created a strange contrast, like two completely different worlds colliding in the same narrow hallway, one driven by noise and dominance, the other by something quieter, something far more controlled. And for the first time, Jason hesitated, not visibly, not enough for anyone to call it out, but enough that he felt it. A fraction of a second where his instincts did not line up with his actions, where something told him this was not going to unfold the way he expected, and yet pride filled that gap immediately, pushing him forward again, his hand lifting slightly as if to emphasize his point, to take control of the moment physically. But before that gesture could fully form into something more, Emily spoke again, her voice just as calm, just as measured, but this time there was something else beneath it, something firmer, something that did not ask for space, but simply claimed it, and it stopped him in a way no confrontation ever had, because it was not loud, it was not emotional, it was certain, and certainty, in that moment, felt heavier than anything he could throw back at her. And around them, the hallway shifted once more, the earlier amusement now replaced with something quieter, more attentive, as if everyone present was starting to realize they were no longer watching a joke unfold, but something far more unpredictable, something they did not fully understand yet. And one of Jason's friends lowered his phone completely, the grin fading from his face as he glanced between them, sensing the same thing Jason refused to acknowledge, that the balance had already begun to tilt. And Emily, without raising her voice or changing her expression, had somehow taken control of a moment that was never supposed to belong to her. And in that growing silence, Jason felt it clearly now, the shift he could not explain, the subtle loss of control that no one had ever seen him experience before. And for the first time, the outcome of this moment was no longer certain, and deep down, whether he admitted it or not, he knew he had already crossed a line. He did not understand how to step back from the space between them held for just a second longer, stretched thin like something ready to snap. But instead of breaking into noise or Chaos. It folded into silence, a silence that pressed in from all sides of the hallway as more students slowed their steps, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. And Jason Miller felt it now in a way he could not ignore. The shift that had started quietly, now settling into something heavier, something that did not belong to him. And for the first time, he was no longer reacting to the crowd. He was reacting to her, to Emily Carter, who still had not raised her voice, still had not moved, with urgency, and yet somehow had changed the entire rhythm of the moment. And that unsettled him more than any confrontation ever could, because there was no clear opponent to push against, no loud defiance to shut down, only that steady presence that refused to play the role he had assigned. And in an attempt to reclaim control, he forced another smile, sharper this time, his words coming out a little faster, a little less measured, as he tried to pull the situation back into something familiar, something where he held the advantage. But the more he spoke, the more it became clear that the energy was not following him anymore. It was anchored somewhere else, somewhere quieter, somewhere he could not reach. And Emily listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, her focus unwavering, as if she was allowing him to finish not because she had to, but because she chose to. And that subtle difference carried weight, enough that even the students who had been whispering moments ago now stood completely still, their attention locked on the two figures in the center of the hallway. And then, when Jason's voice finally trailed off, when the noise he had created lost its momentum, Emily responded, not louder, not longer, just clearer, her words deliberate, her tone calm but firm in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. And it was not what she said that mattered most. It was how completely it shifted the balance. Because in that instant, Jason realized something he had never experienced before, that he was no longer leading the moment. He was inside it, reacting to something he did not understand, and his confidence, once effortless, now required effort to maintain. His posture tightening just slightly, his movements no longer as casual as they had been seconds earlier, and behind him, one of his friends took a step back, barely noticeable, but enough to break the illusion of unity that had surrounded him. Because even they could feel it now, the change that had already taken hold. And as Emily adjusted the strap of her backpack with a small, controlled motion, the kind that spoke of habit and composure rather than nerves, she did something no one expected. She stepped forward, not aggressively, not quickly, just enough to close the final inch of space between them. And in that movement, quiet as it was, there was a certainty that landed harder than any raised voice ever could. And Jason froze for the briefest moment, caught between instinct and confusion, because nothing about this was unfolding the way it was supposed to. And deep down, beneath the surface of pride and performance, something else began to rise, something unfamiliar, something that felt dangerously close to doubt. And in that suspended moment, as the hallway remained completely still, it became clear to everyone watching that whatever was about to happen next was no longer part of a joke. And it was not going to end the way anyone had expected. For a moment, no one moved. Not Jason, not his friends, not even the students lingering at the edges of the hallway, because something invisible had just shifted completely out of his control. And he felt it now in the way his chest tightened, in the way his usual confidence no longer came naturally, but had to be forced into place. And Emily Carter stood there closer than before, her presence steady, her expression unchanged. But now there was something undeniable in it, something that made it clear she was not reacting anymore. She was deciding. And that realization hit Jason harder than anything else, because he was no longer leading. He was waiting. And waiting was never a position he had been in before, his mind scrambling to find something to say, something to do that would restore the balance he had lost. But every option felt wrong. Too loud, too obvious, too late. And behind him, the silence from his friends was no longer supportive. It was uncertain, the kind of silence that does not back you up but quietly steps away. And one of them shifted again, lowering their phone completely now, no longer interested in capturing what had started as entertainment. Because this was no longer entertainment. This was something else entirely, something that made people uncomfortable in a way they could not explain. And Jason swallowed, the motion small but visible, his eyes flickering for just a second as he searched Emily's face for something familiar, some sign of hesitation. But there was none, only that same calm focus. And then she moved, not fast, Not aggressive, just a simple, controlled motion that happened so naturally it almost went unnoticed. And yet in less than a heartbeat the space between them changed. Jason stepping back without realizing he had done it, his balance shifting, his posture no longer dominant but uncertain. And it was not force that caused it. It was precision, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what you are doing and exactly when to do it, and the effect was immediate. The hallway falling into complete silence as Jason found himself off balance in a way that made everything clear all at once. The realization hitting him not in a dramatic explosion but in a quiet, undeniable truth that he had misjudged her completely, and that whatever he thought this moment was going to be, it was already over, and Emily did not follow up, did not press forward, did not turn the situation into something bigger. She simply let the moment settle, let the silence do the work. And as Jason steadied himself, his face no longer carrying the confidence he had walked in with, the weight of every eye in the hallway now felt different, no longer admiring, no longer amused, just watching. And for the first time, he understood what it felt like to be on the other side of that attention. And Emily, adjusting her sleeve with the same calm motion as before, took a step back, not retreating, but resetting the space on her own terms. And without another word, without a single glance of acknowledgement, she turned and walked past him, leaving behind a silence that said everything no one dared to speak. And Jason remained there, frozen in a moment he could not undo, knowing that in less than 10 seconds, everything about how people saw him had changed, and not because of what she did, but because of what she did not need to do. The silence did not break when Emily walked away. It followed her, stretched behind her like something tangible, leaving Jason Miller standing in a space that no longer belonged to him. And for a few seconds that felt much longer than they should have, no one spoke, no one laughed, no one even shifted, because what had just happened did not fit into the usual patterns they all understood, and Jason felt it in the way the air seemed heavier, in the way his usual instincts offered no guidance, no quick recovery, no line to deliver that could turn this back into something he controlled. And as he slowly straightened his posture, trying to reclaim some sense of composure, he became aware of the eyes on him, not impressed, not entertained, just watching, quietly. And that was something far more difficult to face, because it meant there was no energy to ride, no crowd to perform for, only a moment he had to stand in without control. And behind him, one of his friends let out a small, uncertain laugh, the kind that dies almost immediately, not strong enough to reset the mood. And another glanced down at his phone, no longer recording, as if the footage they had hoped for no longer made sense. And Jason cleared his throat, the sound louder than expected in the stillness, attempting to say something casual, something dismissive, but the words did not land the way they usually did. They felt thin, disconnected, and no one responded the way they once would have. And across the hallway, Emily continued walking at the same steady pace, her steps unchanged, her shoulders relaxed, as if the moment had already passed for her, as if it had never required anything more than what she had already given. And that contrast made everything sharper, because while Jason was still inside the moment, trying to recover from it, she had already moved beyond it completely. And as she reached the end of the hallway, she paused briefly, not turning around, not acknowledging anyone, just adjusting the sleeve of her hoodie again with that same small, controlled motion, and then continued on, disappearing around the corner like she had never been the center of attention at all. And back where Jason stood, the reality of what had happened began to settle in more clearly, not as a sudden realization, but as a quiet accumulation of details, the way people were no longer gathering around him, the way conversations resumed without including him, the way even his closest friends avoided meeting his eyes directly. And for the first time, the role he had built so carefully felt unstable, not shattered, but questioned. And that question lingered in the air longer than any laughter ever had, because it did not need to be spoken, it was understood. And as the hallway slowly returned to its normal rhythm, the noise rising again, footsteps moving, lockers closing, there was still something different beneath it all, something that would not disappear as quickly as the moment itself. And Jason, standing there with nothing left to prove and no clear way to reclaim what he had lost, realized that whatever had shifted in those few seconds was not going to reset. It was going to follow him, just like the silence had followed her, and somewhere deep down, whether he admitted it or not, he knew that the moment he thought would define someone else had quietly redefined him. Instead, the rest of the day did not return to normal the way everyone expected it to. Even though the bells rang on schedule and teachers continued their lessons as if nothing had happened, because something had changed in a way that could not be undone, and it followed Jason Miller from one classroom to the next, not in loud whispers or open confrontation, but in quiet glances, in the subtle pauses when he entered a room, in the way conversations shifted just slightly when he walked past. And for someone who had built his identity on control and attention, that quiet shift felt heavier than any direct challenge ever could, because it gave him nothing to push against, nothing to shut down, only a reflection he could not escape. And as he sat through his afternoon classes, he found himself replaying the moment over and over, not the part he had expected to remember, not the part where he stood tall and everyone laughed, but the exact second when everything slipped, when the confidence he relied on failed to land, when Emily Carter did not respond the way she was supposed to. And the more he thought about it, the less it made sense, because there had been no struggle, no dramatic scene, no clear turning point that he could point to, just a quiet shift that had completely changed the outcome. And that lack of explanation unsettled him more than anything else, because it meant he had not understood the situation from the beginning. And that realization stayed with him as the final bell rang and students began to flood the hallways again, louder now, more energetic, but still carrying that undercurrent of something unspoken. And as Jason stepped out of his classroom, he noticed it immediately, the way people looked at him, not with fear, not with admiration, but with something more measured, more aware, and that awareness made it impossible to return to who he had been just hours earlier. And across the hallway, near the exit doors, he caught sight of Emily again, standing by her locker, calmly placing a book into her bag, her movements the same as always, unhurried, unaffected, as if the entire day had passed without significance. And that contrast hit him harder than anything else, because while he had been carrying the weight of that moment all afternoon, she seemed completely free of it, as if it had never belonged to her in the first place. And for a brief second, he considered walking over, saying something, anything that might restore some sense of control or at least give him an answer, but something stopped him, not fear exactly, but a recognition that whatever had happened earlier was not something he could undo with words. And Emily, closing her locker with a soft click, adjusted her sleeve once more and turned toward the exit, her posture steady, her expression unchanged. And as she walked past the crowd, no one stepped into her path, no one tried to stop her, because now they understood something they had not before, something Jason was only beginning to grasp, that her silence had never been weakness, it had been a choice. And as she disappeared through the doors into the late afternoon light, leaving the noise of the school behind her, Jason remained where he was, caught between who he had been that morning and who he was now forced to become, realizing that the moment he thought would define someone else had quietly exposed something about himself that he could not ignore. And for the first time, the question was no longer about her. It was about him. And what he was going to do next. The parking lot was quieter than usual, not because fewer students were there, but because something from inside the building had followed them out. Something unspoken that lingered in the way people glanced over their shoulders, in the way conversations paused for just a second when Emily Carter walked past. And she moved through it all the same way she had moved through the hallway, steady, unbothered, her gaze forward, her pace even, as if none of it belonged to her, as if she had already left the moment behind. The second it ended, and near the edge of the lot, Jason Miller stood beside his car, his keys loosely held in his hand, watching without fully realizing he was watching, because for the first time, his attention was not drawn by noise or spectacle, it was drawn by absence, by the fact that she did not seek attention, did not react to it, did not carry it with her the way he always had. And that difference made everything else feel heavier, more complicated, because it forced him to confront something he had never questioned before, why he needed the crowd, why he needed the reaction, why silence now felt like something he could not control. And as Emily reached the sidewalk, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement, she paused briefly, not hesitating, just adjusting the strap of her bag with that same small, deliberate motion, and for a moment, it almost looked like she might turn, like she might acknowledge everything that had happened, but she did not. She simply continued forward, disappearing into the flow of people leaving campus. And that choice, that refusal to look back, settled deeper than anything else had, because it made it clear that whatever had happened was never about proving something to others. It was about something internal, something grounded, something that did not require an audience. And Jason felt that realization in a way that was difficult to ignore, because it stripped away the framework he had always relied on. The idea that control came from dominance, from being seen, from being the center of attention. And as the last groups of students began to disperse, the noise of the day fading into the distance, he remained where he was, still holding his keys, still replaying the moment, but now with a different understanding, not of what she had done, but of what he had misunderstood. And for the first time, the question shifted from how he could regain control to whether control had ever meant what he thought it did. And as the sun dipped lower, casting the school in a softer light, the realization settled quietly, without drama, without resistance, that respect had not been taken from him in that moment. It had been redefined in front of him, and he had not been prepared for what that meant. And somewhere in that quiet, as he finally opened his car door and sat down, the world outside continuing as if nothing had changed, he understood that the moment everyone else would eventually forget was the one he would carry forward, not as a loss, but as something unresolved, something that would shape what came next, because for the first time, he had been forced to see beyond the surface, and once seen, it could not be unseen. The next morning did not announce itself with anything unusual, the same early light spilling across the school parking lot, the same hum of students arriving, backpacks slung over shoulders, conversations picking up where they left off the day before. But beneath that routine, something had shifted in a way that did not need to be spoken. And as Jason Miller stepped out of his car, closing the door with a softer motion than usual, he felt it immediately, not in what people said, but in what they did not say, in the way no one rushed to greet him, in the way space formed around him, without intention. And for the first time, that absence of reaction felt louder than any attention he had ever commanded. And as he walked toward the entrance, his steps slower, more deliberate, he noticed the details he had ignored before, the quiet conversations between students who no longer paused when he passed, the lack of nervous glances, the absence of that invisible tension he used to create just by being there. And it was not hostility. It was something else, something more neutral, more grounded. And that neutrality unsettled him more than anything else ever had, because it meant he was no longer shaping the environment. He was part of it, and inside the building, the hallway carried the same rhythm as always, lockers opening, footsteps echoing against the polished floors. But as Jason moved through it, there was no stage waiting for him, no audience anticipating his next move, only a quiet continuity that did not revolve around him. And then he saw her, Emily Carter, standing by her locker again, just as she had the day before, her movements calm, precise, placing her books into her bag with the same steady rhythm. And for a moment, time seemed to slow, not because anything dramatic was happening, but because of what was not happening. She did not look up immediately, did not acknowledge his presence, and when she finally did, her gaze met his without hesitation, without tension, just recognition, as if he was simply another person in the hallway. Nothing more, nothing less. And in that simple exchange, something became clear in a way that words could not explain, that whatever power he thought he had over others had never applied to her, not because she resisted it, but because she never accepted it in the first place. And Jason stood there for a brief moment, not blocking her path, not stepping forward, just standing. And for the first time, he did not feel the need to control the situation, did not feel the urge to say something that would define the moment. Instead, he gave a small nod, subtle, almost unnoticeable, but real, and Emily returned it just as simply, no hesitation, no emphasis, just acknowledgement. And then she closed her locker and walked past him, her steps steady, her posture unchanged. And as she moved down the hallway, the noise of the school continued around them, unchanged, unaffected. But for Jason, something fundamental had shifted, not in the world around him, but in how he understood it. And as he turned and continued toward his class, there was no dramatic resolution, no applause, no final confrontation, only a quiet clarity. that settled into place. The understanding that respect was never something you could demand or take. It was something that existed independently of you. Something that revealed itself in moments when control no longer mattered. And that day, without a single word spoken, without a single scene repeated, the lesson remained, not as a memory others would talk about, but as something internal, something that would shape every moment that followed. Because in the end, the loudest change had come, not from what happened in the hallway, but from what was finally understood after the silence settled.